Hello, students. I want to continue looking at the 1950s and 1960s civil rights movement by examining today that moment that happens in many progressive movements when we start to see a split within the movement, a fracturing between different schools of thought. And in the 1960s, around the mid to late 1960s, we're going to see an increase in support for the more militant side of the movement, more focused on self-defense as opposed to the nonviolent integration form of the earlier movement. And this is often because of frustration with slow progress. Brown v. Board was 1954, and many schools had not yet integrated by the mid 1960s. And also frustration with the violence, both from police and counter protesters against black civil rights activists. Shortly after the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, there were a series of riots in urban areas, mostly in the North. These were race riots, like we had seen previously, but unlike previous race riots, like places like Tulsa, in this case, African Americans were targeting white-owned businesses in their neighborhoods and police. Previous riots, we had seen it was whites attacking African Americans, largely as a way of sort of keeping them in their quote-unquote place. And these riots will be a little bit different in that sense. This picture is from the Watts riot in Watts, Los Angeles, a black neighborhood in Los Angeles, where rioting and looting will go on for several days before the National Guard, as we can see here, will be called in to restore order. Probably the worst of the riots was in Detroit in the summer, 65, 66, I believe, where 43 people were killed and $50 million worth of property damage was done. Now, I talked previously about the Kerner Commission, and it was implemented for this purpose to examine these riots that were going on. And if you recall, they concluded that racial discrimination, long-term discrimination, was the source of all of these problems, and recommended some programs, but Lyndon Johnson was unwilling to follow through with these, largely because he was focused on the Vietnam War, and that's where a lot of America's spending was going. And Congress didn't want to, reward the rioters by, trying to undo the problems that led to the rioting, because the rioting is what brought them to their attention. But we will see several instances where private companies will work together and kind of step in to try and provide some investment in the poorer urban areas in response to this. Now, many young African Americans who began to move away from the nonviolent integration and more peaceful sort of Martin Luther King position took as their inspiration Malcolm X, seen in this picture here. Malcolm was a charismatic minister from the Nation of Islam, and he would later break near the very end of his life with the Nation of Islam. He preached self-reliance, self-protection, black pride in African heritage. And he was a supporter, at least early on, in the idea of black nationalism, a belief in a separate identity for African Americans and a racial unity, sort of working together separate from white or non-black society to sort of promote themselves. Now, he softens some of these views on whites and leans a little bit more towards integration than he had before. After his pilgrimage to Mecca, which is a standard part of a Muslim's life. You're supposed to make a trip to Mecca if possible. It's called the Hajj. After this, and after worshiping with Muslims of all sorts of different races and national origins at Mecca, he kind of softens his views a little bit on whites. And this is when we see his break from the Nation of Islam. Shortly before this, he will be assassinated, presumably by 3 members of the Nation of Islam in February 1965. But Malcolm's position is largely one of, you have a right to defend yourself. You have a right to fight back when you are attacked, whereas the nonviolent protests of people like King and John Lewis, you did not fight back. You protected yourself, but you didn't fight back. You didn't meet violence with violence. After James Meredith was shot, the SNCC leader Stokely Carmichael will be one who tries to complete his march against fear. He is arrested, and upon his release from jail, he calls for something he calls Black Power. And what he meant by this, or according to him, was he believed that African Americans should collectively use their economic and political might to gain equality. In areas where they formed a sizable chunk of the voting population, they should try to organize to elect people who represented them. They should patronize black stores or stores that were friendlier to them, rather than, some other businesses from outside of the community. But many whites felt threatened by this idea of Black Power. They feared that it meant black violence, which is not really what Stokely Carmichael seemed to be talking about. The Black Panther Party, we had talked about also earlier, formed in Oakland, and they kind of became symbolic of the militant Black Power group. Many of them changed their names to reflect their African heritage, and their policy of meeting force with force, of self-defense, armed patrols of their neighborhoods and that sort of thing, led to some very violent confrontations with the police and the FBI. Fred Hampton, for example, was killed by FBI and police in a raid on his apartment in Chicago. Huey Newton was arrested after a shootout with the police in which one police officer was killed. Kind of the big turning point for the civil rights movement is going to be the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on April 4th, 1968. King had largely rejected the idea of Black Power and Black nationalism especially. It was much more focused on integration. He still, looked for an integrated society and didn't see a need to focus his efforts away from that. Even after the passage of the Civil Rights Act, banning segregation, the 1965 Voting Rights Act to protect African Americans' civil right to vote, he then moves into what he would dub the Poor People's Campaign. He will live in Chicago's poorest neighborhood for a year and lead protests there. And he starts to address primarily issues of economic inequality, and not just for African Americans, but for whites and Latinos and other groups as well, and not just urban areas, but also in the rural areas. And in fact, he was in Memphis, Tennessee, to support a sanitation workers strike when he was assassinated by a white supremacist sniper. This very famous photo here is King's compatriots pointing for police to show where the shot had come from. This is very shortly after he was killed. And this, riots will erupt after this in hundreds of cities across the United States in response to it. It's really sort of a shocking turning point towards a more militant civil rights movement, as the response was to kill the peace bringer. All this urban violence and movement towards black militancy is going to fuel some of the white backlash that was already there, and a lot of opposition to further reforms beyond ending de jure segregation and protecting voting rights in the South. For a lot of white Northerners, they were comfortable with the idea of breaking down segregation and the voting rights violations of the South, but were not very uncomfortable when the lens was turned toward the inequalities in the de facto segregation of the northern cities and pointing out the economic inequality there. Throughout much of the movement, FBI had a program called Counterintelligence Program, or known as COINTEL, which monitored what they considered to be disruptive or subversive groups or leaders against the social order and attempted to expose, disrupt, discredit, misdirect, or otherwise neutralize. This is a quote from their own mission statement here. Groups like the Nation of Islam or the Black Panthers, or even leaders like Dr. Martin Luther King. In areas of de facto segregation like Boston, for example, from this picture here, they attempted to use forced busing to integrate the schools, to bring kids from neighborhoods far away from each other to other schools, in an attempt to, because the schools were segregated because they drew on the kids from the neighborhood, and if neighborhoods were segregated by sort of tradition and de facto segregation, then your schools became segregated. So they attempted to bus kids to other schools in order to alleviate this. This led to a lot of opposition, sometimes from African Americans as well, who wanted their kids to go to their local school and not be bused an hour one way every day to a white school in another part of town. And sometimes riots. This picture is called Soiling Old Glory. There is a white teenager here about to beat, I've forgotten the man's name, but he's an African-American lawyer with the flag. Really sort of a symbolic sense of what was going on. And this was 1977 in Boston. Affirmative action policies, which will be championed by Richard Nixon, who will follow Lyndon Johnson into the presidency, intended to try and close that economic gap. Intended to deal with the historic sort of systemic discrimination that had led to the current situation between, with the big gap between white and African Americans in the United States. But this was seen by some as reverse discrimination, discriminating against whites in hiring and admissions to school, and continued to spread the white backlash to this. So a lot of the support for the movement is going to start to dwindle in the late 1960s after the assassination of King and the rise of this sort of new militancy. Looking at the graphic organizer for this, I've given you several factors that we can see as signs of or contributing to the shift away from sort of the peaceful integration, cooperation side of things towards a more militant separation, more conflict-focused and self-defense focused civil rights movement of the late 1960s. So, for example, the first one, looking at Watts and Detroit, we can see that the frustration with the slow movement of the civil rights led to violence against police and white businesses, and this, of course, is going to fuel further white backlash. Complete the rest, front and back. Don't forget the reflection questions. I love you. Bye-bye.